Hello, folks, and welcome to Chicano Studies again. We are going to be highlighting two events from Chapter 3 of the Acuna textbook, as well as three individuals in Chapter 4 of the Acuna textbook for this particular video. So let us begin with Chapter 3, the Alamo. A little bit of context of the Alamo. In 1821, Mexico won their independence from Spain, so any land that was formerly owned by Spain became part of the newly independent Mexican state, Mexican country, which included the land in which the Alamo sat in. So Texas was part of Mexico for a little bit. What ended up happening with the Alamo is that you had folks of Euro-American heritage that were granted permission, to set up shop, if you will, in Texas, and they felt like the Mexican government wasn't really taking care of them, and even though they were supposed to abide by Mexican laws, they didn't agree with the Mexican laws, and so they started to think about becoming independent from Mexico. So they're seeking out their own sovereignty, and maybe once they were independent, maybe they could join the American Union. Stephen Austin decided to take the Euro-American grievances into the capital of Mexico. Clearly, the Mexican government was not too thrilled and did not look favorably upon Stephen Austin's requests, briefly put him in prison, and so when he was released, it obviously did not send a very positive message for Euro-Americans, or that the Mexican government was willing to take them into consideration, so they continued to plot, and then they decided to take arms and fight in the Alamo. General Santa Anna was sent in to squash the rebellion because, again, as I mentioned before, it's still Mexican land and these folks aren't abiding by Mexican laws, so they had to go and squash that rebellion. And again, for other Euro-American folks, seeing that their Euro-American brothers were killed at the Alamo, it did not leave a good impression, and it obviously soured U.S.-Mexico relations even further. The Alamo became a rally cry for other battles that were fought in Texas, eventually in California, in Arizona. So eventually, all these battles developed into the full-blown U.S.-Mexico War, which then leads us to the outcome of the U.S.-Mexico War, which is the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was supposed to grant U.S. citizenship to folks of Mexican descent who ended up staying in the newly ceded territories. So Texas, Alta California, Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Nevada, parts of Wyoming, etc., etc. So I believe that the citizenship was granted within 1 year, so they had a year to decide if they wanted to become U.S. citizens. And also the treaty included a discussion of property. So if you are of Mexican heritage and you have a Mexican land grant that says, this is my private property, the U.S. government was going to respect that, and you were going to be allowed to keep your land if you had that land prior to the U.S.-Mexico War and the outcome of the U.S.-Mexico War. Unfortunately, the Treaty of Guadalupe was not very well enforced, and so folks, despite the treaty, lost their land. So that's Chapter 3. With Chapter 4, I wanted to quickly cover three individuals, and I wanted to begin with Juan Seguin. Juan Seguin is a really interesting character. He identifies as Tejano, so somebody who is from Texas, happens to be of Mexican heritage, but prefers to identify as Tejano, and as a Tejano, uh, connects more to the Euro-American cause in Texas rather than to the Mexican government. So he agrees with Euro-Americans that Texas should probably be independent. And so what ends up happening is that he's been very supportive of the Euro-Americans and their efforts to make Texas independent. And then eventually, when more conflict continued between U.S. and Mexico, obviously then eventually leading to the U.S.-Mexico War, it didn't matter how loyal he was to Euro-Americans, he was basically threatened because he happened to be of Mexican heritage, and folks weren't differentiating whether you were quote unquote a good Mexican or a bad Mexican. And so he ended up leaving to live in what is now Mexico. So doesn't matter how loyal he was, he had to take off to Mexico. The next person I wanted to discuss is Juan Cortina. Juan Cortina is of Mexican heritage, but he came from a more wealthier background, if you will, or more wealthier background. And he's at his aunt's ranch. He's noticing that a marshal, if I'm not mistaken, is mistreating one of the employees, and he stops that mistreatment. And what ends up happening is that, he becomes a quote unquote bandit, right? So, because he defends the employee, he's switches career paths, if you will, and became a social bandit. But to the Mexican people, he was a folk hero, and to the Euro-Americans, a criminal. So it's really interesting how the narrative changes from the perspective of folks of Mexican heritage versus Euro-American heritage of a particular individual. So that's Juan Cortina. And then Gregorio Cortes, on a similar vein to Cortina, he's actually not from a more privileged background. He is definitely Mexican. Had purchased a mare, female horse. However, he was questioned about his purchase because the sheriff had received a complaint about somebody stealing a horse. So he's questioning Gregorio Cortes, and what ends up happening is that the deputy doesn't know how to translate very well, and is asking Cortes, "Did you buy a horse?" And Cortes is like, "Yes, I bought a horse, but it's a female horse. It's a mare, not a male horse, right?" So yegua, not caballo, for folks that speak Spanish. Yegua is female horse, caballo, male horse. So he is explaining that he did buy a horse. He didn't steal one, and he's clarifying what kind of horse it is. Unfortunately, the sheriff thinks that Cortes is lying because the deputy has a difficult time translating, and shoots Cortes's brother. To which Cortes is like, "All right," shoots the sheriff, does not shoot the deputy, and then goes on the lam. So on the run, at some point in time, he gets turned in by a friend of Cortes. He's tried twice, and he's eventually found not guilty, if you will, and that's what happened with Cortes. Again, he is portrayed as a criminal by Euro-Americans, or that's the narrative, and then the narrative for Mexican folks is that he's this hero who was basically fighting for his innocence because of what happened with his brother, that it was justified that, you know, for no reason at all, his brother gets killed because of this mistranslation, and that he was justified in doing what he did. So eventually he was captured, he was tried, then eventually he was released. So that's the Ballad of Gregorio Cortes. And again, the distinction is that Cortes is not from an affluent or wealthier background, and Cortina was, which oftentimes class impacts your experience as a person of Mexican heritage in the United States, particularly at the time that they were living. And so we will talk about the impact of social class and race, when race is more important or when class is more important, in a future video. All right, folks, have an amazing day. I will talk to you soon.